The person I'm introducing today is someone I really respect. I think his work has been at the intersection of two things that Plaksha is really serious about: the working of education with industry and then innovating around how you educate as well. So, Sanjay is a professor at MIT, and he's one of the foremost thinkers in the space of RFID and consequently IoT, and helped create some of the standards, industry standards around RFID, which is really cool in itself. And then he went on to become the first director of digital education at MIT and the first dean of digital education at MIT. And he was co-chair of a task force for the future of education at MIT. And this, it doesn't get any cooler than that. And as a result of what the committee came up with, or the task force came up with, MIT decided to invest a lot more in trying to chart the future of education, not just for higher learning, but all the way from pre-KG, higher education, and all the way through to lifelong learning. So Sanjay is now the VP of Open Learning at MIT. He's won several awards. I won't list them, including the NSF, National Science Foundation's Career Award. He's also the author of a book called Grasp, and I would really recommend that you read it. He's literally calling on all of us and telling us that the emperor has no clothes, if you will, that the current way that we teach our children probably is not the right way, and exhorting us to choose a much more effective but revolutionary way. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Manas. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about this exciting opportunity that lies before us, created by a fundamental new understanding of both education and the brain, and also the tragedy that is COVID has sort of forced us into a new world. So what I'm going to talk about today is about some topics from cognitive science that question what we know about how we should educate, and some of the many dogmas and misunderstandings that have held us back. So, our education system is surprisingly old. And imagine if your doctor depended entirely on stuff that was known 100 years ago and nothing new. I mean, imagine where we would be with COVID if our doctor didn't know biochemistry or didn't understand how equipment like ECMOs or ventilators worked, or if our doctor didn't understand how steroids work. Now, our challenge is that that is sort of where education is. So let me tell you, first of all, how old our education system is. It goes back about 1,000 years. And in fact, the first universities go back about 2,500, 2,600 years to places like Taxila, which is now in modern day Pakistan, and Nalanda in Bihar, and other universities, the old Hindu and Buddhist universities. And then that was lost. And then the Islamic universities like Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, Al-Azhar, and then the Oxfords, Bologna's, going back about 1,000 years. And most of them were actually, at some level, monastic. So the basic idea is that, pardon me, I need to get my morning stimulant here. Most of it is based on learning the holy book, whether it's in Hinduism or in Buddhism, whether in Christianity or Islam. And the concept of the degree comes from permission. So you gave another scholar the permission to teach what you learned about the holy book. In fact, the original word for the degree was ijazas. So then the British and European universities, Oxford, Bologna, they start, and they continue along, and then the Industrial Revolution strikes. When the Industrial Revolution happens, two things. One is you want to educate young students to prepare them for the factories, but also when you have working parents, you have to do something with their children. So there's also a childcare sort of functionality. And so those two streams converge. So we take the monastic approach and we take the factory approach, and that's our modern education system today. And it worked really well for the British because they came to India and they wanted to prepare Indians to become clerks and become workers in the British Empire, which we very happily became, notwithstanding the extraordinary genius of many Indians who both excelled in science, but also decided not to buy into that and participated in the independence movement. But it's sort of tragic to me that here we are, in 2020, and we're looking back, and without changing what we learned, we follow it with rules and regulations that have not changed. This is in schools and this is in higher ed. The fundamental challenge and the fundamental misunderstanding with the factory model of education is this. It is the assumption that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And all the professor has to do is write on the student's brain and declare victory. And if the student doesn't pay attention, you can go to the student and say, you didn't pay attention, and try and make them feel bad so they actually pay attention. That's not how the science tells us the brain works. How do we know this? We've studied the brain over the last 100 years. It started with someone called Ramon y Cajal. He was the man who generated the first drawings of neurons and really was visionary in figuring out how the brain works and how synapses are formed. The brain is not a sheet of paper for the professor to write on. The brain is a growing body, a growing organism. Actually, ironically, it doesn't grow, it prunes by changing the connections between the neurons. And it formulates a model of the world. You should think of it more like a plant growing. You can't give a plant water when you want to give it water. You have to give the plant water when it wants water. You can't give it potassium or fertilizer when you want to give it potassium or fertilizer. Imagine if you took a plant and you gave it a lifelong supply of water on the first day and said, okay, you're set for life. It doesn't work that way. There's evaporation. The plant needs to draw water from the ground. Potassium is at the right time. Nitrogen has to come at the right time. In fact, that field is called precision agriculture. Similarly, the human brain is trying to formulate a model of the world. And this model requires taking chunks of information, digesting them, organizing them. And that cycle is 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes, when professors keep talking like I'm doing now, the student is sort of loses it. In fact, what happens after the 10, 15-minute chunk is the student goes into a different mode, which is they start becoming familiar with the material, but they're not learning it. And that's actually worse because false familiarity breeds an illusion of learning. You're better off realizing you don't know it than to think you've learned it and not learn it. Now, when the brain is forming an image of something, when it's trying to figure out, let's say you teach multiplication and the brain's trying to figure out how is it similar to addition, how is it different? After 10 minutes, it has to sort it out. When it sorts stuff out, it tends to remember things at different paces and actually tends to forget something. So, for example, when I learned just a couple of days ago, I was reading about GIS systems, which is basically cartography and mapping. And within a day or two, I've forgotten some of the concepts. Now, is it because I wasn't paying attention? No, it's because when the brain absorbed that material, it retained different aspects of it at different levels and forgot some stuff which is low-level detail. When forgetting occurs in the education system today, we tend to have this impression that somehow the student is at fault. But let me just tell you that forgetting turns out to be a fundamental step towards learning. In other words, when you forget, what's happening is the strength of the synaptic connections in the brain. In the first time you learn something, the synaptic connections are made with something called a neurotransmitter, which is it's a chemical connection between the synapses, and that's how the memory forms. But when you start forgetting stuff, the neurotransmitter, think of it as it sort of evaporates and it vanishes. So the second time you remind someone, and the third time, the brain says, oh my God, the neurotransmitter isn't good enough. I need to drop yet another synapse. And so there's a physical change in the way the brain forms memory. That's called long-term potentiation. Well, that's one of the mechanisms of long-term potentiation. So it turns out forgetting is actually a good thing. But the key instinct of the teacher should be to remember when a student is forgetting, not make them feel bad about it, but use that as an opportunity to remind them. That results in longer-term memory. And it goes on and on. I mean, for example, we know now, not just in learning intellectual topics, but also in things like sports, that you're better off in what is called interleaving, which is you're better off doing one thing and then another thing and then come back to the first thing. So if you're doing, let's say in intellectual, let's say you're teaching math. So let's say you're teaching exponentiation and logarithms, right? You might think, let's do a bunch of exponent problems, and then let's do a bunch of log problems. Actually, you're better off doing exponent, log. And the reason is the brain is really terrific when it notices differences. Now, and the learning is not doing the exponent, but it is recalling how to do exponents. So when you switch, you're forcing the brain to load a different program. And that's where the learning occurs. Now, the tragedy right now in COVID is such a strange situation. You have almost 1.5 billion students, actually more than 1.5 billion students, who were separated from their educational institution during the spring of this year, March, April, May. And so what did student teachers do? They went straight to Zoom and they did their lectures on Zoom. Now, the problem with that is Zoom captures the worst of both worlds. So first of all, we took our regular lectures where we applied none of the tricks I applied that I described, and we just put it on Zoom. And second, the only saving grace of the traditional regular lecture is that at least students have some peer pressure. There's another student, and they sort of, if you don't understand something, you could say, teacher ne kya kaha, you can sort of ask. Of course, there's distraction also, but that peer pressure is very important. And at least the student can be seen by the teacher, and the teacher can interact with the student. You can have some fun. You can change the topic. That's also gone. So we're in the worst of both worlds. In the future, when we go back to regular classrooms, had better not be the Zoom lecture recreated in the classroom. What a waste that'll be. The luxury of being together, which I wish I could do. I wish I could visit India. I wish I could visit my family. That luxury is a very special luxury. And we took it for granted. We squandered it. When we were doing it together, we should be talking to each other, not just one person talking, but we squandered it. Instead, one person just talks like we do on Zoom. When we have it back together, let's not recreate what we could have done on Zoom. For all its problems, at least Zoom has advantages. It's convenient. It's better for climate change because you're not getting on a plane or a car or a bus and going somewhere. Let's do a lot better. So what can you do that's better? Now, first of all, one thing you cannot do better in person is one-way lecturing. And the future, in my view, is not Zoom lectures, but asynchronous lectures. And what I mean by that is the professors recording lectures in advance. Now let's think about that. Imagine if you could have Einstein give a lecture in physics. Now, I teach dynamics, which is a field of physics. I think Einstein could give a much more inspiring lecture than me, and I'm pretty good. I would rather have Einstein give the lecture. So should the professor even be recording the lecture? Or are we better off using lectures that were highly produced by someone who's really good at it and really has good production quality and has thought about it? I actually think it's the latter. So the future is we will use video lectures. Most of them will come from someone else. Unfortunately, Einstein did not record too many lectures. There are a few. But imagine if Eric Lander, who was at Harvard and MIT, who sequenced the human genome, could give a course on genetics. That's going to be better than anything most professors at MIT can produce. So let's use that lecture. You send the student to that lecture. And all these tricks I described, like make the lecture short, you can do that online. You can do that in person. Looking for forgetting. Actually, you can do that online. You can actually measure if someone's forgetting and remind them. Interleaving, which is, switching between topics. Very hard to do that in a regular lecture. You lose the classroom, but much easier to do online. So push all the lecturing online. And when we are together, just imagine if you haven't seen your parents in some time or your children in some time, you're back together. Are you going to talk to each other? Or are you just going to sit down and lecture them? Well, that's the same thing with the classroom. When we're back together, we should be doing a few things. One of the things we know from neuroscience is that, and in fact, we know from evolution, is the human being is a learning animal. We form our we are the most immature animals at age 20, right? Most animals by age 1 are basically adults. And the reason is the human being has to learn because we're very adaptable. And Dr. Amrita Vora posts there exactly, it's flipped learning, flipped classrooms, right? But a much more multidimensional flip. So how do we initiate learning? It turns out the way to initiate learning, and there's actually a term for it in English, is curiosity. And we can show that when you make a student curious, the student's brain activates something called the dopaminergic circuit. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's very central to learning. So other neurotransmitters are serotonin, dopamine, melanin, et cetera, et cetera. But dopamine is very central to learning. So once you activate the dopamine circuit, which is what you do when you can only do in person, right? You can do it, you can do that online as well, but you can even do it even better in person. You can go on a field trip, you can go to a factory, you can go to a museum, you can go to a library, you can go to nature, and you can say, what's happening there? Why is that happening? Generate that. That's so much better done in person. Once you do that, let the students go off in flipped classroom mode and go watch videos from Khan Academy, from other sources, and look for content. They will drink it up. By the way, just as when you're hungry, the mouth cell will generate saliva. When you're intellectually hungry, it's curious, the brain generates dopamine. So think of dopamine as the saliva of learning. Once the brain is in that mode, send them to Khan Academy and students will gobble it up. Let them gobble it up. And when they come back again in the classroom, focus entirely on playful, creative projects. Let them do homeworks in the classroom and then coach them. Let them do projects in the classroom and then coach them. So that is the flipped classroom. Now, the problem with the flipped classroom is a lot of people think, I'll just have students watch stuff online and come back and everything will be fine. Nope. You have to set it up. You have to give the students context and curiosity. And when you do that, you create something called intrinsic motivation. Once intrinsic motivation is generated, then students will consume the content. And the content has to come in short bites, like 10-minute videos. You can do very complex things with 10-minute videos. The other day, I was trying to remind myself of a fairly advanced field in mathematics called tensors. And it was, a few hours of videos, all 10 minutes. I watched it. It's fantastic. I was curious. I'm an adult. There was a reason I was curious about it. I had forgotten it. Forgetting is important. And so when I refreshed, I remembered it so much better. For students, you need to give them context and curiosity, and then let them go absorb this material. And then when they come back, when you have the luxury of being with them, celebrate it, right? For every problem they do at home, you should be working a problem with them in the classroom. You should be telling them, nahi beta, not like this. Think of it this way. Okay. Oh, your mental model. Or maybe think of it this other way. It's almost like psychoanalysis. You should be working with them, as I said, on projects, field trips, etc. Make the classroom absolutely something that students would love to be in. I want to maybe close with an example. In this great country I live in, the United States, I had the great luxury, by the way, of growing up in one great country, which is India, and living in another great country. One of the things about the United States is the diversity here. So my daughter, when she was in high school, her Spanish teacher was actually a Vietnamese American, Senor Tran. Now, by the time he was teaching systems like Khan Academy, all the online stuff on YouTube, by the time she was taking the class, were everywhere. And there was a particular software program called Quizlet, which was actually founded by an MIT dropout. It's a flashcard-based learning thing. A beautiful, beautiful system. So what she and her all her classmates, what they would do is, by the time they enter the classroom, they'd already learned the Spanish. They would watch it on YouTube. They would practice on Quizlet. They would talk to each other on Google Hangouts. They would talk about it. And you know what they did in the classroom? Fascinating. Not in one class did Senor Tran have them work on Spanish grammar, like recitation. Never. In every class, he would make them write and act out skits and plays. And in the context with coaching, he would say, no, that's gender. You got the gender wrong. You got to change that. You got the grammar wrong. Maybe that's the wrong word. Use this word, but in a very constructive way. But what the students were actually doing was writing and playing out little drama, and the kids would absolutely look forward to these classes. It was fascinating. I mean, this was their most popular class. Senor Tran eventually won an award, a national award for Spanish. So I'm going to stop there and just say that, I like to joke and say that the 21st century begins next year, 2021, because everything is changing this year. A lot of it is for the bad, unfortunately. A lot of people are out of work, economy, of course, COVID has caused devastation. We've lost loved ones, etc. But 2021 is an opportunity for renewal. And in education, such a fundamental industry, such a fundamental human necessity. For God's sake, let's start new and different and make this absolutely a glorious 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay. And we have some questions coming in now. And the first question that I'll take is one that's also close to my heart. It's about 10-minute videos. And I've also been totally flabbergasted over the last years with my kids and how much they love these 10-minute videos and how much can be crammed into them. So the question is, how can a complex concept be explained in just 10 minutes? And maybe you might want to use some of the examples that we had talked about earlier. Because I think people need to go and watch them themselves to understand this, but that's the question.
Thank you, Manas. As a PhD yourself, you know that we all take really complex concepts. We all learn them, but the great challenge is breaking them down into little pieces, and that's actually as great an intellectual challenge as building the complex challenge, a complex concept in the first place. The fact is, those complex concepts came out of small incremental inventions and breakthroughs. So it's not like someone suddenly figured out, Einstein didn't suddenly figure out general relativity one day, right? He had lots of little tips.
I think we lost your audio.
Can you hear me? Yeah. If you take the great teachers, the Feynmans of the world, the even Einstein, the Carl Sagans of the world, not only were they profound thinkers, but they were able to reconstruct profound thinking in small chunks. So if you look at Feynman's lectures, which are for me a Bible, I have 2 copies of them, right? Or if you take, for example, Claude Shannon's papers, the profundity is in it's that amazing ability to construct the complex concept from small bite-sized chunks that we can all understand. The Taj Mahal is built out of bricks and pieces of marble, right? We can absolutely do it. And I think this is the failure. With a 40-minute lecture lets you get away with a you don't have to break things down,
Yeah, and I also find it fascinating that if you watch videos that trace the history of evolution of a concept, because that's how it happened with step after step, it's both interesting as a story and interesting to parse it, right? You have to sort of turn off that thing in your head that everything that you are hearing is correct, because sometimes you find out halfway through that it had to be adapted or had to be ditched. But I think it's again this, it becomes bite size again if you tell the history, right? So,
I completely, in fact, you hit, by the way, if I may, you hit a nerve in a wonderful way for me. We tend to start with lemmas and theorems and expect the students to understand it. That's nonsense. Because even the great mathematicians, Poincaré, Bernoulli, the great physicists, did not arrive at those concepts suddenly in whole cloth. They were human beings. They struggled. If you read Poincaré, he says, I was trying to figure out what happens if you draw a circle on a sheet of rubber. Rubber had just been discovered, right? You stretch it. What happens? So it humanizes it. But somehow we presented theorem first, which is so ridiculous. So this breaking down into bite-sized chunks is stunning. It's called we actually look down. How sad is this? We look down on spoon feeding, but we know as parents, all of us, spoon feed our children, right?
Yeah.
So let's put some joy into spoon feeding. It's okay,
I also, I think when the last time we spoke, I was telling you that my kids will be really excited that the people behind Veritasium or Physics Girl. It is Physics Girl, right? Physics Girl and the others.
Physics Girl,
maybe,
yeah.
Maybe you can introduce the audience to some of these channels, because I think they are really, really cool.
Yeah. I've taught at MIT for 25 years, quarter century. And, I think I'm a good lecturer, but I'm telling you, these guys put me to shame. So go to YouTube, right, and search for Physics Girl. She's an MIT alumna, actually. Or search for 3 Blue, 1 Brown. It's a channel started by a Stanford grad, Grant Sanderson, who then worked at Khan Academy. By the way, it's called 3 Blue, 1 Brown. It's playful because his eyes are blue, except one quarter of one eye is brown. That's why I called it 3 Blue, 1 Brown, right? Or half of one eye. So, or look at Veritasium, or look at Crash Course Physics, right? Or look at Vihart. What these people do is, I think they've actually invented a new profession. And the profession is explication. That's actually, as you know, an English word, but taking explication and turning it into an art form. How do I make something fun and interesting and bite-sized, but I'm actually not losing the profundity? For example, 3 Blue, 1 Brown recently had a video on something called, on quantum mechanics, basically, right? It's quantum mechanics and polarization. I'm just telling you, I wish I had come up with that video. So let's just take a hat off to these people and say, oh my God, you nailed it. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the future, right? And I couldn't do better than that. So I'm happy to send my students to look at that and then turn the classroom into a discussion. By the way, lecturing, some people do it really well and some people have really thought it through. Coaching is a democratic skill. We can all be great coaches because we're all parents and we were all children.
Yeah, we have a lot of teachers in the audience, and a lot of these are these people, and actually we at Plaksha as well. We are thinking about how do we make this work, right? So I think it's at 2 levels. As an individual, how do you make it work? And this requires also some assets, etc., that you might need to use, like videos, for example. And then as an institution, how do you make it work, right? So what kind of design, what kind of culture, what kind of departments or offices? Because not everyone is an MIT with a whole lot to invest in these different specializations around digital learning, etc. So how do you see a typical school or university adopting this?
It's very interesting, Manas. I've thought a lot about it. I mean, the first comes with, rolling up your sleeves, right? So the professor has to, first of all, think of themselves not as some godly figure, but just another human being trying to convey to a human being, how to think about something. So a few years ago, I was visiting, one of my colleagues was in Singapore at a university we were building, and I was looking for him. I just landed in Singapore, and I was looking for him. I didn't find him. And so finally someone said, oh, Professor, the professor is there. So I couldn't see. And then I finally looked. He was underneath the machine tool, fixing the machine tool. I just saw his feet. That's why I didn't notice him, right? Roll up your sleeves and get to work. So there's a culture of that. By the way, at MIT, I have even my 17-year-old students call me Sanjay. And if they call me dude, right, I am very proud. If they high-five me, I'm proud. Because this is not about hierarchy. I want them to respect me not because I'm a professor. I want to respect them, and I want them to respect me for what we are. It's got to be mutual. It's got to be sincere. It cannot be hierarchy. So it starts there, right? But it also, there's something I think a little bit self-affirming about standing on a lecture hall. That's good. We should do that too. But really sort of imposing a hierarchy and say, I know this and you don't. But to be able to, like a parent, suppress one's ego and help the other person grow, right? That is a mindset. And creating an environment, a structure, encouraging that, creating the workshops, the labs, even the classroom, the shape of the classroom, the way the desks are organized to encourage that, whether it's a round table, whether you're teaching the students, giving them agency or making them feel judged. These are the questions that I think a good institution will and should answer.
I love the part about hierarchy. I think that hierarchy just kills this, or this sort of overbearing stuffiness of hierarchy just kills this. It's just incompatible, perhaps, with hierarchy. It's a really good point. I mean, I think that every institution should have that at the top of its list, and I'm pushing for the same at Plaksha, right? To have a non-hierarchical sort of structure.
Hierarchy, Manas, is often a defense of the insecure.
Yeah. Totally. One question, that people you said people have very short attention spans. Do you think it's a product of our times, or is this something that is sort of wired into us? And the second follow-on question is that should we be working on increasing these attention spans? And especially if you're doing research, for example, is that basically by increasing his attention spans?
Yeah. So first of all, that there's a part A and a part B. Part A is when you absorb something. Part B is when you do something. Okay, they're different things. When you're absorbing, 10 minutes is what we should not try and exceed 10 minutes, but we should shoot for 8 to 10 minutes, maybe even between 7 and 10. The problem is we used to shoot for 1 hour, right? In IIT, or MIT, or all the schools I've been, it was 1 hour, which is actually scientifically not right. So, and then we would make students guilty for not concentrating for 1 hour. But 6 to 10 minutes is actually sensible. It should not be 1 minute. And I think that's where the cell phone, the distraction, it's not so much lack of attention span. It is the addiction to distraction, right? It's like, imagine you're trying to maintain a diet and you're addicted to the ritual of taking a snack, right? So I think we should shoot for about between 6 and 10 minutes. For that 6 and 10 minutes, yeah, people must pay attention, but we should not expect 30 minutes. That's input. Part B is output. When people are doing something, that is not when they're absorbing, but they're doing something what they know. There is a mode. It was reported by the scientist Mihaly. His name is Csikszentmihalyi. His first name is also Mihaly. His last name is Csikszentmihalyi. He's a Hungarian psychologist, and he wrote a book called Flow, FLOW, Flow. And you can go hours. And actually, a lot of young people have that, right? When they play a game, they're playing for hours. That's actually flow. But if you get them excited about building a project or doing art, they can go hours. And that's a different type of attention span. But we shouldn't confuse the two.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. One of the great things that you just said was about curiosity being the saliva of the brain. I just love that phrase. That our job is to, as educators, is to create that saliva, if you will, right? Bhavika asks, what are the ways to generate curiosity in the virtual world? So how do you get students to feel curious in the virtual world?
It's actually not that easy. Because we are social animals, it is not that easy, but you can do it. And so for example, let's say you're teaching dynamics, right, which is a vibration or something. One thing you can say to students is find everything before the class, in your home, that is vibrating, right? Like there's a fan rotating, the fan frame is vibrating, right? The car goes by, the table vibrates. You can see the water oscillating right there. So when you come to the classroom, right, you can say, report all the kinds of vibration you saw. And someone might say, when I speak, the when there's a noise outside the window vibrates, right? So you have to find these little tricks, and it's very unique to the class, to the texture of the class, the content, to the people, etc. So it's not easy, but in a classroom, you can be much more structured about it. And you can use props,
Right. I'm just following the questions as well, right? So someone asks that, Dr. Shanti asks that, do you think that the teaching should be standardized? The teaching approach should be standardized, or in an institution? And I know you have views on that. That's why I picked the question, at least on the workflows and stuff, right? But so, or is there room for creativity?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for creativity. And in some ways, in the United States, by the way, every classroom, every teacher makes up their own lesson plan. That to me is wasteful. In fact, it kills creativity, right? So I think there's a middle ground, which is what you do is you standardize things like, listen, if you're teaching, I don't know, biology, here are the half a dozen lectures that broadly cover a curriculum. Use those on YouTube, right? Make sure they watch this, and this, or this, that, and that. But in the classroom, you see the actual, if you do coaching, if you're doing, if you're trying to make people curious, it's actually it's very exciting for the students and the teachers to be very creative, And then the other thing I recommend is teachers talk to each other and recommend to each other what worked for them, and each has to personalize to their personality and to their own interest. Teachers' interest should come shining through. So there's a lot of opportunity for creativity, but strangely, the creativity comes from standardizing on the other side, which is, if you say half a dozen video lectures, you make the room for the creativity, but we do neither right now.
Yeah, absolutely. We just have time for one last question, and this question is, how do you motivate yourself, or how do you get yourselves charged up for this work that you're doing, and what are your goals? What would be sweet success for you?
I think, Manas, in some ways, I have to say that I apply very similar principles to the one I espouse, right? I think I like to remain curious. I'm very lucky. I have friends and family who are similar. This morning in my IIT Kanpur WhatsApp group, classmates, there were half a dozen. There were, every week there's a puzzle posed or some interesting fact, and we talk to each other. Yesterday, I spoke to one of my classmates, as a professor at Johns Hopkins. So I'm very lucky in that respect. But the most important thing to me is I try and stay curious. And when I'm curious about something, I just gobble up stuff, What I'm hoping is, as we enter the 21st century, which is next year, as I said, more and more of our students will have to become the CEOs of their own lives. So what I'm hoping is we stop treating them like passive sheets of paper that we can write on, and rather like self-efficacious agents of their own life, the CEOs of their own lives. If we can do that, there's no stopping these wonderful, amazing minds from achieving extraordinary things.
Well, that's all we have time for. Sanjay, thanks a ton. It's very inspiring to hear you speak. We have been inspired at Plaksha, and a lot of what you said is also true, by the way, just for organizations in general. So, it totally resonates. You want to build great organizations, you want to build great educational institutions, you have to sort of move towards this modern way of thinking about individuals. We're not, building the pyramids or something where you need 10,000 slaves and so on, right? The tools we have today are so powerful that each individual can do such a lot. And we haven't just even tapped that. We haven't even touched that. So thank you very much, Sanjay, and for everything. Yeah? Thanks.
Great to see you.